Events. I'm Jolene Whitney. 'Tis the season, and for the road crews who drive the highways and byways of Vermont in its 251 municipalities, that means it's time to fire up the snowplows and get out on the roads. Salt, plow, repeat. Old habits die hard, but Vermont is trying to reduce the amount of salt it spreads each winter. Today we'll learn what it takes to shake off the salt and move to salt brine. The same, but different. And that difference means less pollution in Vermont's waterways. To discuss how Vermont is reducing its reliance on road salt, I'm joined by Mark French and Chris Stepanuk. Chris is a UVM professor and an associate director of Lake Champlain Sea Grant, and Mark is the road foreman at Hyde Park. Thank you for joining me today. Mark, let's start by talking about what salt brine is and what kind of equipment is used to apply it.
Salt brine is 23.3% salt water. We have a brine maker to make it, so you would need, it's a kind of a two-part, you need to access to brine or a brine maker, which we have a brine maker, and our trucks hold a storage tank on the truck to haul our salt brine down the road with plumbing to our spinner with a 12-volt pump that just pumps it on to pre-treat our salt.
And Chris, the problem in salt is the chlorine for the most part?
Yeah, so it's usually what we use is, or what they use is sodium chloride, and so it's the chloride is what we often track in waterways, and we can see impacts on aquatic life as a result of the chloride getting into the waterways, as well as vegetation, and can change the soil microbes and make the heavy metals that come off of, say, cars be able to move through waterways and contaminate groundwater.
Okay, and so why is salt brine not have that same impact?
So it's not that it doesn't have the same impact, it's just that the crews are able to use less salt, and therefore we're not impacting the environment as much because of the ability to use less salt.
All right, and Mark, obviously you work for Hyde Park, and what kind of changes have you seen since implementing the salt brine?
We've seen reduction of our salt budget. So we've reduced our salt budget by still maintaining a safe road. And like Chris just said, we can turn our salt down because it's all in our road. It's not scattered off to the outside. We don't get a balance factor, so everything that we put out stays in the center of our road.
All right, and let's talk a little bit about the cost. So what is the cost for using salt brine and the equipment involved?
We're looking at like $5,000 a year for maintenance and a 10-year replacement of our machine.
Okay, is the cost barrier something that a lot of small towns are facing when implementing things like
Yeah,
this?
so I did a survey of Vermont and New York municipalities, and one of the top barriers to being able to shift to using brine to pre-wet the dry salt on the truck at the spinner is the cost to invest in the equipment that they need to be able to do it. So like Mark said, the brine maker or the tanks, and then the nozzles and the fittings that go on the trucks to be able to pre-wet that dry salt in the truck before it hits the pavement. So the cost it's one of the number one barriers for the communities here.
Okay, and what's the going cost of salt this year if you were just to use regular road salt?
Ours for District 8 is $91 a ton.
Right, and you work in Hyde Park, which is a town with a population of around 400. So if both of you want to let me know, like, what's the value of implementing something like this in such a small area?
I don't think it matters of the population, because I think the taxpayer is a taxpayer no matter what population is. We did it because we were trying to save our salt budget, save our taxpayers money, but on the other hand, try to help the environment as we did it.
Yeah, and other towns like in Lake George, New York, or in Merrimack, New Hampshire, have put like enforcements on using rock salt. Should Vermont increase their use of those enforcements?
So one of the things that I've seen, we had a workshop recently with Mark and his team, and there was a lot of interest following that or coming to that event and then in follow-up. And there's other communities that are also doing other types of things to try to reduce salt. So I'll use South Burlington as the example. In addition to using a liquid brine, like the Hyde Park is doing, they also use what are called segmented plows. So there are lots of different teeth of the plow, and it can do a better job scraping the road. And they also have what are called like a secondary plow, so they have a front plow and a second plow behind it. And those two things, cleaning the road has also helped them reduce their use of salt, because if you don't have snow or ice to have to make the salt work its way through, then it can just do its job more easily. So the communities, I think the communities are interested in finding ways. They're really interested in what Mark's been doing, and they're interested in what South Burlington is doing, and wanting to do the right thing to use less salt, because it saves money, it saves the environment, and it's just the right thing to do. And we've seen just really phenomenal interest. So I don't know if we need more regulation. I think that there's a lot that can be done simply by the voluntary interest of the communities to want to reduce the use of salt and to reduce the costs associated with it.
You talked a little bit about the cost-saving measures, and obviously you work with public municipalities, but do you work as well with private contractors, and should they consider implementing salt brine as well?
Yeah, so private contractors have been implicated in about 50% of salt contamination to the environment in some studies, and we have worked with private contractors here in the basin, and there is interest among them as well to try to make changes for both saving costs as well as saving the environment. And so yes, there's opportunity for the private contractors to either use a liquid brine directly. There's something called anti-icing if you put it down ahead of the storm, or if you do like Hyde Park is doing, they're again pre-wetting the dry salt at the truck before it hits the road, and it helps it stick to the pavement. So the private contractors can do the same thing, and that means that they don't have to go out and resalt as much because it's staying place where they want it to be. So definite opportunity for the private contractors.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell me a little bit about the workshops you do around salt brine, Chris?
Sure. So it's being driven by folks like Mark, who said, "Hey, we're doing this. Chris, we'd love to share it with others. Can we have an event?" And so I took Mark's call and kind of ran with it. And Mark then did a lot of the recruiting for the event that we had. But we have had other events over time, some directed towards private contractors. We looked at driveways and parking lot best practices. We've done conferences in partnership with other organizations around the basin, like the Lake George Association and ADK Action, and trying to educate people about what is the science of salt, why do we want to use less, how can we use less, what are the best practices that are known. So over the years, we've had a number of just different sorts of educational programs with different entities and in different spaces.
So it sounds like it's been a pretty expansive program. What have you gotten out of it, Mark? What have you seen in your community?
I've seen, well, going back to her class, like going to her class, it was very interesting to see the scientific proof that this is what's going on. They've got test wells. Then you get to see new modern technologies that's out that we can implement, which we've done. Mm-hmm. So that was a good thing from going to one of her classes.
And you two have obviously been putting in a lot of work to promote using salt brine, but for Vermonters at home, what are things that they can implement in their hometown to help make your jobs easier as well?
Well, one of the things that we're hearing from the communities, there's a cost to invest in this equipment, and so if people can support their communities to be able to have the budget to invest in the equipment that's needed to get into the game, then they can start to see cost savings after that. There's also a clean water budget that the state is having comments on right now, and if people are willing to share their thoughts about that budget, there is opportunity for the state to be able to support grants and other kinds of funding for the communities to be able to get the equipment that they would need to use these new technologies. And so if people can say, hey, state of Vermont, we support that, you would consider having the communities be able to use the funds that you have available for road salt new technologies, that would be beneficial because the state may actually then make that decision.
And so for homeowners, say I have a very long driveway, is that something I could implement on like a personal basis using salt brine?
You could. It's a little bit tricky. So you because as Mark said, it has to be a 23.3% solution. If it's not, then you can get things that you don't want to have happen. But say if you have a very long driveway and you work with a private contractor, you can talk to your private contractor about what they're doing, right? And maybe they can use brine, or they could use a pre-wet salt, or if you can narrow the space that you need salted in anybody's regular living space, minimize the places that you're salting, and then also for somebody who's just indirectly or directly salting by hand. If you try to have 3-inch spacing between your salt grains, you don't need piles of salt. Also, always shovel before you salt, and then if you do have salt after a storm, pick it up and use it again later, rather than letting it sit there and wash off into the vegetation or the waterways.
And we've talked a little bit about how New York and New Hampshire are implementing some salt brine practices. How about going out west where there's obviously a lot bigger snow as well? Talking about Montana or Colorado, how are they implementing salt brine? And if they're not, what are they doing to help keep roads safe in the winter?
Yeah, so my understanding is that they are doing some what's called anti-icing, again, ahead of the storm, putting down a liquid solution. I think they use magnesium chloride, which is a different product that goes to a lower temperature than sodium chloride. And my understanding is that they hadn't used salt in the past a lot, and in the mountain areas they're requiring other things like chains on tires, simply because they can't get into the hills and the mountains quickly enough with all the traffic that's there to be able to maintain the conditions. So there isn't necessarily the same picture of how salt is used here out there where there's really, really snowy situations.
All right, Mark and Chris, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
That takes care of another Across the Fence. Thanks to everyone here at WCAX for making today's program possible, and thank you for stopping by Across the Fence. Have a good one.